sit in there for us, okay? Would you like a blanket to stay warm, okay? Do you want a
Did you
blanket?
wash them?
These are brand new, they've never been used. So I just need you to go in there, okay? Again, you're just going there to sit in there.
I know, but look how long, because my dog.
Okay, well, the more you're cooperating with us, the quicker we get you out of here.
The incident begins in a location that is rarely associated with law enforcement encounters: an animal emergency hospital. Unlike traffic stops or street-level calls, veterinary clinics operate in a state of controlled urgency. Clients arrive not merely inconvenienced, but emotionally compromised. Animals are often viewed as family members, and perceived threats to their survival can provoke panic, anger, and grief within minutes. This environment is not neutral, and it matters profoundly when assessing police conduct. Officers arrive following a report of a rowdy individual. This framing is important. The initial call does not describe violence, weapons, or a crime in progress. It describes behavior: disruptive, emotional, uncontrolled. From the outset, this is a behavioral call, not a criminal one. In such cases, the constitutional authority of responding officers is narrow. Their role is limited to restoring peace, ensuring safety, and determining whether a legal threshold for detention or arrest exists. When officers make contact, they encounter a woman who is visibly distressed. Her emotional state is elevated, her speech rapid and confrontational. She is not calm. But emotional volatility alone is not illegal. The Supreme Court has long recognized that citizens do not forfeit constitutional protections because they are upset, rude, or loud, particularly in moments of personal crisis. Almost immediately, the interaction becomes adversarial. The woman perceives the officer's presence as obstructive rather than helpful. She believes she is being prevented from attending to her dog. This belief, whether accurate or not, shapes every response that follows. From her perspective, authority has entered a medical emergency without clear justification. For the officers, this is a familiar problem. Law enforcement culture places heavy emphasis on command presence. Officers are trained to establish control early, particularly in emotionally charged environments. The difficulty arises when control itself becomes the goal rather than safety. The moment officers prioritize compliance over resolution, escalation becomes more likely. The verbal exchange intensifies. Officers attempt to manage the woman's tone. She responds by challenging their authority and questioning why police were called at all. This is a critical juncture. When a civilian asks why law enforcement is involved, officers must internally reassess their legal footing. The burden is on the state, not the individual, to justify intrusion. Instead of de-escalation, the officers respond with firmer commands. This marks the first clear escalation. Commands without explanation tend to provoke resistance, particularly from individuals already under stress. The woman's responses become sharper, more confrontational. Importantly, though, they remain verbal. At this point, there is still no clear articulation of criminal conduct. Disorderly conduct statutes are often misunderstood. They do not criminalize emotional expression. They require conduct that disrupts public order to a degree that poses a legitimate concern for safety or operation of a public space. Courts routinely warn against using these statutes as contempt of cop laws. The woman asks whether she is being detained. This question changes the legal landscape entirely. A detention is a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. It requires reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed. Officers must be able to point to specific, articulable facts, not generalized annoyance or disrespect. The response she receives is not a clear articulation of those facts. Instead, authority is asserted through declaration. She is told she is detained. The reason given centers on her behavior, framed broadly as disorderly. This moment is legally fragile. If reasonable suspicion did not exist prior to the declaration, the detention itself may be unlawful. From this point forward, the encounter enters a feedback loop. The woman reacts negatively to being detained. Officers interpret her reaction as confirmation that detention was necessary. This circular reasoning is a hallmark of escalation failures. Resistance created by authority is then used to justify that authority. The veterinary staff enters the equation more forcefully. They express frustration and a desire for the woman to be arrested. This is another pivotal moment. Private citizens and business employees do not decide arrests. Their preferences are not legal standards. However, officers often feel institutional pressure to solve the problem presented by complainants. This pressure can distort judgment. Rather than independently evaluating whether arrest is lawful or necessary, officers may unconsciously adopt the perspective of the reporting party. In this case, staff frustration appears to become a proxy for criminal justification. The decision to arrest is made. The charge is disorderly conduct. The woman is informed she is under arrest. This is the precise moment where the encounter crosses from questionable to consequential. An arrest is not merely a control tactic. It is a deprivation of liberty. It carries downstream effects: jail intake, court appearances, potential criminal records. Notably, the arrest occurs while the underlying emergency, the dog's condition, remains unresolved. This creates a moral and practical conflict. The original disturbance is rooted in fear for an animal's life. Removing the owner does nothing to address that fear. Instead, it compounds it. As officers move to apply handcuffs, the woman's distress escalates further. She continues to protest verbally, questioning the legality of the arrest and expressing outrage at being removed from her dog. Again, her behavior is hostile but not physically violent. This distinction is essential. Use of force policies often differentiate between active resistance and verbal resistance. Here, the resistance remains verbal. The officers proceed with custody. Commands become more frequent. The tone hardens. The power imbalance becomes absolute. The woman is no longer a participant in a conversation. She is an object to be processed. From an analytical perspective, this is where officer psychology becomes most relevant. Law enforcement training emphasizes officer safety, but it also instills a strong aversion to perceived disrespect. When civilians insult officers, question their authority, or challenge their knowledge of the law, some officers experience this as a threat to status rather than a constitutional interaction. This psychological response can override procedural caution. Instead of asking, "Is this arrest necessary?" the internal question becomes, "Can I allow this behavior?" That shift is subtle, but dangerous. Policing is not about enforcing respect. As the woman is escorted away, the officer's language reflects irritation rather than necessity. The focus is no longer on restoring order, but on completing an arrest that has already been set in motion. This is institutional inertia at work. Once authority has escalated, reversing course requires humility and administrative effort. The removal from the clinic also raises questions about proportionality. Even if the woman's behavior was disruptive, was arrest the least intrusive means available? Could officers have separated parties, issued a warning, or allowed medical staff to continue treatment while remaining on scene? These alternatives appear not to have been meaningfully considered. Instead, the arrest becomes the solution to a problem that was never clearly criminal. As the woman is taken into custody, she continues to assert that she is being punished for speech. This claim resonates because the record shows no physical altercation, no threats, and no refusal to leave prior to detention. Her words are offensive, they are inappropriate, but they are also constitutionally protected. The First Amendment does not protect individuals from consequences imposed by private businesses. It does protect them from government punishment based solely on expression. When disorderly conduct statutes are used to suppress speech, courts often intervene. At this stage, the encounter has fully transitioned from crisis management to rights violation risk. Everything that follows, transport, processing, citation, flows from this initial decision to arrest. If that decision is flawed, the entire chain is compromised. The unresolved tension at the end of this phase is stark. The woman is removed from a medical emergency. Officers have asserted authority without clearly articulating necessity. The original problem remains unsolved, and a new problem, yes, a criminal charge, has been created. This is where part one must pause. Not with resolution, not with judgment, but with the recognition that a single moment, the choice to escalate rather than slow down, has reshaped every outcome that follows. Once the arrest decision is made, the encounter enters a new phase, one that is often less visible to the public, but far more revealing in terms of institutional behavior. This is the processing phase. It is here, away from the initial scene, that the rationale for the arrest must withstand scrutiny, not from emotions, but from procedure. The woman is now fully under custodial control. Her freedom of movement is restricted. Officers no longer need her cooperation to maintain authority. And yet, the interaction does not stabilize. Instead, it oscillates between rigid enforcement and inconsistent accommodation, revealing uncertainty beneath the surface of control. From a legal standpoint, this phase is critical. Any arrest must be continuously justified. Probable cause is not frozen in time. If new information emerges that undermines the basis for arrest, officers have an obligation to reassess. This duty is often overlooked, but it is real. As the woman continues to speak, angrily, erratically, often offensively, officers increasingly frame her behavior as validation of their earlier decision. This is a psychological trap. Post-arrest behavior cannot retroactively create probable cause. Courts are explicit on this point. What matters is what officers knew and observed at the moment custody began. Yet, the narrative begins to shift. Officers reference alleged behavior that occurred before they arrived. Claims of intoxication and aggression are introduced. These assertions appear not as contemporaneous observations, but as justifications layered in after the fact. This sequence matters. When justification follows enforcement rather than precedes it, legal vulnerability increases. No standardized field sobriety evaluation is conducted prior to arrest. No clear articulation of impairment is documented on camera at the moment of detention. The claim of intoxication, therefore, rests heavily on third-party reporting and post hoc interpretation. This is a weak foundation for custodial arrest. Meanwhile, the woman's emotional state remains unstable. She vacillates between hostility and moments of compliance. Officers respond inconsistently, sometimes commanding silence, other times engaging in dialogue. This inconsistency signals something important. The situation is not out of control. If it were, accommodation would not be possible. Small gestures begin to appear. Water is offered. A blanket is mentioned. These actions are not trivial. They demonstrate that officers recognize distress rather than danger. They suggest that de-escalation was always an option, one simply not chosen earlier. The power dynamic subtly shifts. The woman is still restrained, but the tone of authority softens. This shift implicitly undermines the earlier narrative of threat. If she were truly dangerous, comfort measures would be inappropriate. This contradiction is central to understanding the encounter. As processing continues, the woman repeatedly returns to a single concern: her dog. This fixation is not incidental. It reinforces that her emotional volatility stems from fear, not criminal intent. Officers now begin to acknowledge information from the veterinary staff, indicating that the dog is stable. This revelation is pivotal. The original justification for heightened emotion, imminent loss, is no longer valid, but the arrest remains. The officers now face an institutional dilemma. To release her immediately would require admitting that escalation may have been unnecessary. To continue processing preserves authority, but deepens the disconnect between cause and consequence. The decision is made to issue a citation rather than pursue full booking. This is a compromise, a procedural off-ramp. It allows officers to exit the encounter without fully abandoning the arrest decision. However, issuing a citation still constitutes a criminal charge. The harm is merely delayed rather than avoided. The woman is informed she cannot return to the veterinary clinic. Trespass authority is asserted. Notably, this restriction is imposed after the arrest, not before. This sequencing raises questions. If trespass was the appropriate remedy, why was arrest necessary at all? The woman challenges the charge, insisting that speech alone cannot justify arrest. While her delivery is combative, the substance of her claim aligns with established constitutional doctrine. Officers respond not with legal explanation, but with procedural finality. The matter they imply will be resolved elsewhere, in court. This deferral is common in policing. Rather than resolving ambiguity on scene, officers often rely on the judicial system to sort out legality later. While lawful in form, this approach transfers the burden of error onto civilians who must now navigate courts, costs, and consequences. A turning point emerges when officers decide to escort the woman back to retrieve her dog. This decision is revealing. It represents a partial reversal, an acknowledgement that continued separation is unnecessary. Importantly, it also demonstrates that the woman is capable of compliance when treated as a participant rather than an adversary. The power dynamic changes again. Authority remains, but it is no longer absolute. Officers negotiate, conditions are set. Cooperation is sought rather than commanded. This transformation exposes the contingency of earlier escalation. If cooperation is now possible, why was arrest inevitable earlier? The answer lies not in law, but in institutional momentum. Once officers commit to a narrative, disorderly, intoxicated, aggressive, reversing course requires more than reassessment. It requires confronting the possibility of overreach. As the escort proceeds, tension remains. The woman continues to speak freely, often offensively. Officers tolerate behavior they previously claimed justified arrest. This tolerance further erodes the claim that her conduct posed a legitimate public order threat. At the clinic, officers supervise the reunion. The dog is released. The emergency concludes quietly. There is no outburst, no renewed disturbance. The feared chaos never materializes. What remains is paperwork. The citation is issued. A court date is assigned. The woman leaves with her dog, free but not unburdened. The criminal justice system now looms ahead, detached from the emotional crisis that triggered everything. This phase ends not with resolution, but with administrative closure. The officers have completed their task. The woman has been processed. The system moves on, but the legal and ethical questions remain unresolved. Those questions define what comes next. By the time the woman leaves the veterinary clinic with her dog, the visible conflict has ended. There are no raised voices, no commands, no restraints. To an outside observer, the situation appears resolved. But in the context of law enforcement accountability, this is not the end of the incident. It is the point at which consequences begin to diverge, quietly, unevenly, and often invisibly. For the woman, the encounter does not conclude with relief alone. She leaves carrying a criminal citation, a court date, and the burden of proving that her behaviors had just met during one of the most emotionally destabilizing moments of her life did not rise to the level of criminal conduct. Even if the charge is later dismissed, the process itself becomes the punishment. Time, anxiety, legal fees, and the lasting memory of being handcuffed while her dog lay in a treatment room. For the officers, the outcome is less immediate. Their authority was exercised, their decision-making recorded, their paperwork completed. There is no automatic review triggered by a disorderly conduct citation. No internal alarm sounds when an arrest does not involve violence or injury. Unless a formal complaint is filed or legal action pursued, the encounter may never be examined beyond routine administrative closure. This imbalance is structural, not personal. Modern policing systems are designed to process enforcement actions efficiently, not to interrogate their necessity. Accountability mechanisms exist, but they are reactive. They depend on civilians navigating complaint processes that are often opaque, intimidating, or slow. The body-worn camera footage, however, changes the equation. Cameras were introduced to provide transparency, but they also expose something deeper. How quickly authority can harden when challenged, and how slowly it softens when new information emerges. When analysts review footage like this, they rarely focus on isolated insults or emotional outbursts. Instead, they examine timing. The precise moment when detention is declared, the justification offered at that moment, the sequence of escalation. These details determine legality. In this case, the timeline is unforgiving. The detention precedes clear articulation of criminal conduct. The arrest follows verbal confrontation rather than physical disruption. The alleged intoxication is asserted after custody begins, not demonstrated before. These sequencing issues matter enormously in court. Disorderly conduct statutes are intentionally broad, designed to give officers discretion in managing public order. But that discretion is not unlimited. Courts repeatedly caution that such statutes cannot be used as catch-all tools for punishing behavior officers find irritating, offensive, or disrespectful. The First Amendment looms large here. Speech that criticizes police, mocks authority, or expresses anger, even crudely, is protected unless it crosses specific legal thresholds. The footage suggests that the woman's speech, while abrasive, remained squarely within those protections. What complicates matters is the environment. An emergency veterinary clinic is not a traditional public forum, but it is a place where heightened emotion is expected. Officers are trained to account for context. Failure to do so increases the risk of misinterpreting distress as disorder. Another factor emerges in the background: institutional stress. Officers reference other calls, limited time, and competing demands. This pressure can incentivize quick resolution over careful assessment. Arrest becomes a way to close a call rather than resolve it. This is not a failure of individual morality. It is a systemic vulnerability. When policing metrics prioritize efficiency, officers are subtly encouraged to favor decisive action over nuanced judgment. The escort back to retrieve the dog underscores this tension. The decision demonstrates flexibility and humanity. It also implicitly acknowledges that the woman did not pose a continuing threat. That acknowledgement, however, comes after the most consequential decision. The arrest has already been made. In legal review, such contradictions are difficult to ignore. If a person is calm enough to be escorted back into the scene of the alleged disturbance, supervised but cooperative, the argument that arrest was necessary to restore order becomes weaker. The citation issued at the end represents another institutional compromise. Citations are often viewed as lenient alternatives to arrest. But legally, they are still criminal accusations. They shift the burden of justification from the officer to the court system, where the individual must now defend themselves. From an accountability perspective, this shift is significant. It insulates officers from immediate consequences, while externalizing the cost of error onto civilians. Even successful defenses rarely result in departmental review. The footage also highlights a recurring pattern in modern policing: the conflation of authority with control. Control is not inherently illegitimate, but when maintaining control becomes more important than resolving the underlying problem, enforcement can lose its grounding in public service. The underlying problem here was not crime. It was fear. Fear for an animal's life, fear of being unheard, fear of power being used arbitrarily. None of these fears are alleviated by handcuffs. In the broader context of law enforcement accountability, encounters like this rarely make headlines. They are too ordinary, too familiar, and that is precisely why they matter. Public trust erodes not primarily through extraordinary abuses, but through everyday interactions, where authority feels unnecessary, inflexible, or dismissive. The officers involved may never receive feedback on this encounter. The woman may or may not contest the citation. The court may dismiss the charge without comment. The system absorbs the incident and moves on. But the footage remains. It becomes part of a growing archive, not of dramatic misconduct, but of subtle overreach, of moments where patience might have changed everything, of decisions made under stress that hardened into consequences. For departments committed to reform, footage like this is invaluable. It offers an opportunity to examine training around emotional distress calls, to reinforce constitutional boundaries, and emphasize de-escalation not as a tactic, but as a priority. For communities, it reinforces a painful lesson. Knowing your rights does not always protect you in the moment. Legal vindication, if it comes, often arrives long after the damage is done. The final unresolved tension is not about guilt or innocence. It is about necessity. Was the arrest necessary to ensure safety? Was detention required to restore order? Or did authority escalate because it was challenged? These questions do not accuse. They examine, and they remain unanswered not because they lack importance, but because the system is not designed to ask them often enough. When the camera stops recording, the encounter ends. But its implications do not. They ripple outward, into courtrooms, into policy debates, into public perception. And in that sense, this was never just an argument at a veterinary clinic. It was a case study in how power is exercised, how easily it escalates, and how difficult it is to unwind once it does. That is where this story truly ends. Not with closure, but with accountability still pending.